Hi. So I've noticed that I've had an inclination to shut down my creativity and to become quiet. I'm looking at how this shutdown and this fear of exposure has been rooted in a deep set of shame, and also rooted in a kind of cyclical trauma process that has taken up a big, like a large, serious, significant amount of my life. And some of the clarity that I'm having now is that this trauma cycle and this essentially addiction to the trauma cycle is perpetuated by allowing this shame and this guilt and this insecurity and this hiding and this fear of being seen. And so in order to bust out of that cycle and to reinstate myself in a more liberated way that aligns with a deeper core truth and a need for creative energy and expression and voice and all sorts of different embodiment aspects to occur, means that I need to face the fear and also nip this addiction to shame and addiction to suffering and addiction to pain and addiction to controlling things and addiction to hiding in the butt. And that is what I am going to be doing now. So we all have our stories, right? We're all subjected to significant life circumstance and events and things that hook into us and hook us into patterns and hook us into what we define ourselves as, becomes our identity. And so once we've fixated on that identity, like for me, there's this sense of victimhood, and there's also this sense of like needing to rescue. And so here I am in a identity that's trying to control, failing at controlling by design, and squashed into this tiny little person, basically addicted to the drama of being small and suffering and failing, which does a number of different things. But for the creative potent force of embodiment, it reverses that. So the more that I attach on to controlling or some over emotional idea of compensating and fixing my projection of somebody else's suffering or dysfunction or whatever it is, I deny the creative force and the creative spark and the wild, life-filled, life force-like nature of my being, which I think is essentially what we're all doing when we're wrapped up in these stories that become belief systems and identities that are maybe aligned for a while, maybe necessary to learn through, but they're also constricting old stories, patterns that we keep repeating, kind of living in the past perpetually with like no propensity to, I don't know, rewire the future, redirect our trajectory, alter the world around us in a way that is more aligned with this creative infinite potential and potent energy. So what feels like the hardest thing for me to do right now is to jump back out of this victim, control, trauma, pain body, suffering identity and back into this creative, like almost gives no fucks, but is just like totally open, totally present and like flowing, and has all of this potency for potential, like inspiration, infinite energy, like exploration, and it comes in a state of presence that is so unmoved and unswayed by the dramas that this altered version of me that I also am attached to, this shell of an identity that's a past, that's an idea, that's linked into because of some needs or some ideas of needs and some unconscious stuff that like is a big mess. It's like a giant fucking mess. So it cancels out the pure potential, the openness, the possibility, the aspect of creator and godlikeness in all of us. And I noticed that one of the things I get caught on is this idea that I am abandoning my little dream idea projection of suffering and dysfunction, and by not suffering, I am selfish, do not care, heartless, perhaps even evil, selfish, all these weird connotations that, if really examined and really felt into, isn't true at all. It's this sort of slave-like mentality that creates the victim and perpetrator and facilitates the function of this victim-perpetrator, like slavery, like stuck feeding into a thing. And that could be with anything, like this is trauma loops or false identities, and that can also be with food or substances or you name it, like whatever it is that we get hooked onto, and then begin kind of confining and trapping ourselves into that solid state, which this innate creator, like potent energy that has the potential for literally anything, gets drowned and suffocated and stifled, and then stops expressing, stops coming out, stops being what it is. And that in itself is the most painful thing. That is literally the abandonment of what we are to become an idea of what we should be. While living in a world, in a system that essentially survives and thrives off of this. And there's a lot of intricacies, there's a lot of dynamics that feel complex to navigate and weave through. Also, simultaneously, it isn't a truth. That's the other shadow shell of the identity or of the concept and the construct that you've been locked into, that's telling you that it's super complex, that's telling you that it's gonna take a lot of fucking work, that's telling you that it's gonna be like so hard, or it's gonna be so anti-life and anti-people and anti-connection and family and so on and on and on. But right, we're all inherently connected, and we're all part of this same sort of creative, infinite, like beautiful spark of ourselves and of being and of life and of creative energy and freedom. So following that is actually absolutely in line with the integrity and the well-being of everybody around us in the most ultimate sense. So it's a little bit of a trap, and I found myself out of this trap. And then slowly, as this year's progressed, I found myself weaved back in to the trap, and it catches me in all sorts of different ways. I mean, like with the shame and the guilt, pretty significant ways, and like, oh, something's wrong with you if you don't follow this like dysfunctional, complex like thing and then suffer with it because everybody's suffering in it. Well, that may be a valid point. That may be a totally fine way to live my life. There's this other sense, other part of me that is activated and that I feel that's just like, wait a second, I know I can be free, and I actually have been free, and I know that the experience of being aligned in this state feels way more valuable to the whole dynamic, even the little trauma circle web world thing, than being stuck in it and suffering and victimizing myself or victimizing the circumstance or victimizing the concept of whatever the fuck it is. And you know, that gets even broader. Like, you could go into the idea of racism, fighting for rights, like becoming an activist, your opinion on COVID, like whatever the fuck it is, it doesn't matter. It still locks you into a perpetuating, polarized dynamic that doesn't feed the freedom that we can't access when we get out of it. And the idea is illusory. The idea that we're somehow abandoning someone, abandoning something, by choosing not to suffer, by choosing to be free, by choosing the self, by actual self-love, and not locking into codependent, enmeshed, crazy-ass cycles of slavery and pain and suffering, which is perpetuated in a world that exists on a hierarchy, such as it is. So if, I think, and this is something I'm just beginning to explore, if we have the capacity and have had the capacity to understand and process being outside of this, then if we have a responsibility to anything, our responsibility is to ourselves and is to cultivate that place and that space. And what that looks like and what that might mean, I don't necessarily know. Does this have anything to do with money and power and gaining access to whatever you want? In some ways, but not so specifically. Like, not so literal. Abundance, joy, expansion, life, desire to live, experiencing the awe of the totality of like the human dimensions is absolutely powerful and rich and abundant and alright. And literally the only thing that shuts us down and shuts us away from access to that is the slave desire to keep ourselves small and locked into these things based on our identity and belief systems, which I have to, and this is what I'm realizing now, is I have to examine where I've put a false judgment upon myself, like the idea that I'm bad, and therefore sleep back into a shame idea, and therefore pushed around by the actual, like, almost intelligence of the construct itself, the trauma web itself, and stuck bouncing around in the web of this thing, this mess, because I've allowed this negative, like, false belief to have a reign and have power over me, making me susceptible to rejecting the creative potency, hiding, shutting up, not expressing what I feel is true, and literally shaming myself. So as I feel like I'm reactivating a certainty that needs a lot more exploration, I also feel that openly processing this is going to become extremely important for me and extremely valuable. There's not necessarily, it seems off in a sense, but you can't get out of a victim trauma cycle by staying in it and trying to force everyone around you out so that you can be out of it. It doesn't work that way. We have to do this ourselves. And I think the biggest thing that's rewiring me here is a level of forgiveness for, okay, I'm human, like, okay, I have a brain, okay, I live in a whole complex series of, like, hive mind truths and realities and people and all sorts of different expressions of that, and a life that's basically educated me that suffering and pain and trauma and, like, abuse and, like, all of that stuff, like, is just, you know, what we deal with as humans. And forgiving that like letting go of that charge and this addiction to suffering, this addiction to being in pain and a victim, and like over romanticizing suffering and over projecting the idea of romanticized suffering in others, and like needing to control it and all of that. And it's a trap. Totally a trap. So yeah, I hope that's somewhat helpful and interesting. I'm gonna continue sharing this process because I think hiding and constricting has not been working for me. And so openly processing or openly articulating a path to freedom and a path to liberation and a path that reinstates that creative spark and creative flow and creative force, for me, requires showing up in ways I might otherwise not, or be afraid to. So, like, if I'm locked in a shame kind of dynamic and I'm shaming myself, but projecting that shame, or like just all sorts of distortions, the action of openly sharing and addressing this place of shame decharges that shame, because it almost normalizes and frees me from the charge, or the idea of like acceptance or belonging or whatever stupid word I could put in that's not really relevant. It's just the act itself of changing, shifting the energy and the circumstance, and from victim to productive, from victim to learning, from victim to complete total expression of truth, is ultimately completely aligned with that raw, creative, beautiful force that has infinite potential and can change our world if we want it. So, thanks for watching.